This tutorial is sponsored by the 3D Coloring Book, a project specifically designed to help empower artists who are struggling with texturing in Substance Painter and to help show you that anyone can create beautiful pieces of art with just a little bit of practice and guidance. To instantly gain access to hundreds of pre-made professional level models and hours of high quality tutorials, click the link in the description and begin your journey today.
Hi everyone, my name is Finn Stevens-Locke and I'm a 3D environment and prop artist, specialising in stylized hand-painted art. In this video, I will show you how I made this witch cafe scene from scratch and be talking you through each step, from concepting to setting up the final render and presentation. This project only really contains 3 steps, but there's a lot in those steps. Step 1 is concepting and block out. Step 2 is modelling and texturing, and step 3 is rendering and presentation. The programs I used in this project are 3ds Max and Blender, I used both, Photoshop, 3D Coat, and Marmoset Toolbag 3. And I just want to say a really quick thank you to Stylized Station for reaching out to me to do this video. The first thing is collecting your references. For references, I recommend places like Google, Pinterest, and Artstation, which is especially good if you want to model from a concept. For my own piece though, I started with Oakita's art from Twitter as a base for my concept. I really enjoy the dreamy colours she uses in her art, and I really wanted to bring that pastel thing to my scene. And I also knew I wanted to attempt to bring the chunky, stylized style of World of Warcraft to my scene. My final inspiration were these cafes I found that have trees in them, and also witches. The idea for the scene came about because I really missed seeing my friends during the COVID lockdown, and I really wanted to create something that reminded me of them. So during the initial sketch phase for my scene, I was mainly trying out camera angles and the placement of the props that I had in mind for this cafe, namely these smaller sketches here. The biggest sketch on this page is the one that I did over the 3D blockout that I created in Blender. The reason that I created a blockout in Blender of this scene is that I personally prefer to noodle things out in 3D rather than 2D, purely because I know that I'm going to be creating a 3D scene, and what you may concept in 2D may not translate well into 3D. So here's the blockout that I created. I created it using very simple shapes. It's also easier with a 3D blockout to test the ideas for your camera angle, because not all of them will work. I did have an idea to do a top-down camera angle. However, you can see here that it just wouldn't have worked with the scene because the tree would have blocked a lot of the details. Now with the camera angle and the blockout done, I sketched over it to that sketch you saw earlier to add some details, and then I went to work on my colour palette. When creating my colour palettes for the scene, you can see I tried a lot of different things. It was important for me that the scene looked cozy, but I also wanted it to feel magical. I did try to do something that was more pastel overall, but I kind of felt that it wasn't really working, so I went for a more darker palette with some pastel accents. And I gravitated more towards purples, blues and pinks, because in my mind that's a lot more witchy than the warmer palettes that I tried. And in the end I added the pop of green as just a little accent colour to kind of break up the very similar colours that I was working with. So this is my final concept for the scene, and you can see that it looks really rough compared to the actual sketches that I made. But that's okay. We're making a 3D scene, not a highly polished concept piece, and it's also a personal piece, so I wouldn't fret too much over an ugly concept. As long as it means something to you and you understand it, then that's the most important thing in creating a personal piece, I think. If you were obviously creating concept for other people, you'd want it to have a lot more information than this. So now we're moving on to the modelling. A good rule of thumb for making a scene is to work from the biggest to the smallest in terms of your assets and build the scene up from there. I began with the textures for the walls and the floor. A lot of the scene is actually just made up of tiling textures that I made and composited myself in Photoshop. Tiling textures are a really great way to save time and texture assets quickly. The way that I made them was by using the offset tool in Photoshop, and I'm going to show you very quickly how that works. So I started with the very basic shapes for my stone floor and used the offset tool that you can find under Filter, Other and Offset with Wraparound selected to check the seams at the edges. With offset, you need to use half of the width and or height of your texture to get it to wrap around properly. So for this texture, which is 1024 pixels, I entered 512 into the offset filter for both. And using this filter, you can create tiling textures easily. So now that you have your texture, to create the tiling textures, I composited them all manually in Photoshop myself, copying and pasting them, making sure they lined up together, and then putting it onto the UV. To work out where to add the dirt, what I did was I imported the whole scene into 3D Coat and then used the Calculate Occlusion to bake the AO into the floor. And what that did was show me exactly where the assets were on the floor. As you can see here, you can see that star shape. That's where the tree is. So that's where I wanted to put the dirt. And with a dirt texture that I created, I did the same thing. I copied it, made the whole thing dirt, and then using a mask, I painted it around that AO and then made it look like it was under the bricks. And that was how I created those two blended textures. So now we're moving on to the bigger assets of the scene. First, I want to talk to you about the tree and give you a little demo of how I created the flowers and the leaves. The tree is basically just a bunch of cylinders that I modelled, shaped them a little bit, and placed them in a rough tree shape. And the texture is just a tiling bark texture that I made quickly in Photoshop. And then I actually tiled this in Marmoset. There is a tiling feature in there, so you just apply the texture and then up the tiles in the material editor. So here's how I created the flowers and the leaves. In 3ds Max, I created a plane, added the diffuse and the alpha, so you can see exactly where the edges of your flowers and leaves are. Using the cut tool, I cut around the shape, not really thinking too hard about where I want the verts right now, just cutting them out. And then once I'd cut out the shape, I detached it using the detach button to make it its own object. And then back with the cut tool again in vert mode, I added the topology just to give me something to work with when I shape it. Now, with Preserve UVs selected, which I believe is in the Edit Geometry drop down in 3ds Max, you can actually move the verts without damaging the UVs. And then I was adding more topology, editing the verts to make sure that there was like enough distance between them. And then what you can do is, well, I rotated the shape first, so it was at sort of 90 degrees from the floor, which is where I wanted it. And then using the verts and the line tool and stuff like that, I shaped it, gave it a bit more depth to make them look like a clump of flowers. Did that same thing with the leaves. And then here's the finished tree, and you can see that I've just taken those leaves and those flowers and repeated them hundreds of times around the tree. So this counter was pretty simple to make, but here I wanted to give you a demo of how I paint stylized with textures. Then we have these supporting assets. With the opal table, I left the smoothing group off in the end because I actually like the faceted look and the way that the light hits it and you can see all of the polys. I think that looks cool and gem-like, which was what I was going for. All of these smaller assets have been textured with gradients, which is a great way, again, of texturing smaller assets that don't need that much detail. You're not really going to see them in detail in the whole scene, so it's not necessary. So gradients are great for that. I modeled them really quickly. I also projected their UVs. I didn't unwrap them manually and created gradients for their textures. And there is some like minimal painting on the book, for example, and the coffee mug. And the mushrooms, I also added an emissive map to create that glowy look. So with that, with everything put together, our scene is complete. I want to talk a little bit about how I approach rendering in Marmoset Toolbag. I don't really have a process when it comes to rendering, so what I would suggest doing, which is what I do, is just playing around with every setting until you find something that looks good for your scene. You can find a lot of different settings in both the render and the camera menus, and once you play around with that, find something that you're happy with, it's just a case of taking some beauty shots of your piece. So thank you very much for watching this video. I hope I was able to teach you something and that you enjoyed watching a little bit of my process. Bye bye.